Hey guys, going on? I wanted to send my condolences out to two legends in the music business today that we lost, that passed away. One is Little Richard, as you can see in the title, and the other is um, Andre Harrell, founder and former CEO of Uptown Records, which is responsible for such acts as Mary J. Blige and Jodeci back in the day, and Heavy D. But first of all, Little Richard, yeah, he is the one of the pioneers of rock and roll. Man, he would often say that he was the king of rock and roll, the real king of rock and roll, and it's hard to dispute that. In the 1950s, obviously during a time where there was a lot of racial strife, he was one of the first um, artists to cross over from the black rhythm and blues um, musical genre and charts to the white audience with the song Tutti Frutti. And he was one of the original LGBT flamboyant type artists. Um, Good Golly Miss Molly was another one of his songs, and they tried to copy his style. Pat Boone did in the 50s, because in those days, if you had a successful rhythm and blues artist, uh, a Caucasian artist would try to copy it and make their own version of it that was watered down. But people wasn't really checking for the watered down version. They wanted to hear the real version of this song. Yeah, but he was a legend. He's him, Fats Domino, and Chuck Berry, to me, were the three original pioneers of what would become the sound that would become rock and roll. Before Jerry Lee Lewis, before Elvis Presley, and before Carl Perkins, Little Richard was doing it. He invented his own sound, the boogie woogie sound, the stride piano sound. And um, likewise, Andre Harrell kind of years later kind of pioneered his sound on the mix of R&B and hip hop, and to bring the hip hop into the R&B, which they kind of go hand in hand now. So both two legends in the music business lost on this day, May 8th, 2020. You know, it's really sad because a couple of years ago, Chuck Berry passed away in 2018, and Fats Domino passed away. And then, like I said, these guys were the original kings of rock and roll. You know, rock and roll started from rhythm and blues. It was a name that was created uh, by Alan Freed, the Ohio DJ, to mask the original racial origins of the music, because it was taboo, like I said, for um, white teens to listen to um, this black, quote unquote, black R&B music that was, before it was called R&B in the 40s, it was called race music. Then they wanted to de-emphasize the racial part of it, so they changed it to rhythm and blues, and then they wanted to de-emphasize it even more, so they changed it to rock and roll. But Um, the original music was um, rhythm and blues, later to become rock and roll, and it was Little Richard's style that later artists like Prince and Jimi Hendrix and Freddie Mercury from Queen and David Bowie copied. All that cross dressing and that type of gender bending stuff, all that stuff started from Little Richard. Little Richard was the first to do all that stuff. He originated that sound and that style of that flamboyantness. Later, he would go on to denounce rock and roll when he became a preacher. And he would say that rock and roll was the devil's music. And you would oftentimes see him, on documentaries about on the history of rock and roll. And he would let it be known that rock and roll was indeed a black invented genre of music, predominantly black, and that he was one of the pioneers of it. He would always say that. And one of my earliest memories of him, besides hearing John Goodman's version of his song in 1991's King Ralph, was seeing him at WrestleMania 10 when he sang the national anthem. And seeing the wrestler Mark Merrow, whose original gimmick was based on um, Little Richard because Mark Merrow kind of resembled Little Richard. So his gimmick was based on Little Richard, and originally Dusty Rhodes wanted to his theme song to be Tutti Frutti, but they changed it to Johnny B. Good. Changed his name to Johnny B. Bad. But yeah, he looked just like Little Richard with muscles. So that was one of my earliest memories of Little Richard before learning a lot about his music and the impact that he had. But anyway, peace to Little Richard. Um, he's definitely a legend that will be missed. People from that era are not, you know, the, are passing away like crazy. Bill Weathers died earlier this year, and of course, we know that Ray Charles is no longer with us, and um, Fats Domino is no longer with us. Chuck Berry is no longer with us. So, that era is lost. But as far as them being here, but that original era of rock and roll in the 1950s is still immortalized in song. And people like Little Richard, who basically changed the world because it was through rock and roll music that um, racism began to be broken down, and that racism wasn't not that it wasn't bad because racism still exists now, but artists broke down that wall musically, at least, um, for a while between black and white artists. But unfortunately, the black artists like Little Richard and Fats Domino and Chuck Berry never really got their just due. In history, when they record who invented rock and roll and who started rock and roll, people will say, "Oh well, it was Carl Perkins with Blue Suede Shoes, or it was Elvis Presley with Hound Dog." But rock and roll existed before them. you know, Rock and roll existed with uh, Big Joe Turner and Shake, Rattle, and Roll, and Little Richard with Good Golly Miss Molly and Tutti Frutti. You know, so rock and roll definitely has a longer history than just the late '50s. What they're talking about. It goes all the way back um, to Robert Johnson, which cues to a Netflix documentary that you guys should watch if you're interested in the history of music, particularly rock and roll and the blues, about Robert Johnson. He was one of the greatest blues guitarists of all time, and that supposedly he sold his soul to the devil at the crossroads, which has a lot of African symbiology to deal with Eshu and Elegua, and it goes a lot. It goes really deep. But watch that documentary, and then also watch Leon Robinson's movie on the life of Little Richard. And I'm going off on a tangent, but R.I.P. Little Richard. Good Golly Miss Molly is one of my favorite songs, and you know, peace to the early generation of rock and roll, and also peace to the early generation of modern R&B, which basically kind of started with Andre Harrell. Peace.